Alright everybody, for today's critical thought, we're going to continue our look at variants or designing replayability in your game. The last time we focused on biomes, what they are, what it means to creating a game, especially creating a game space. For today, we're going to look a little bit deeper down and discuss loot tables. And we're kind of going to cheat a little bit and spend the first few minutes discussing what it means when you have a fixed pool of items and how they appear in a game in terms of balance and progression. Now, fixed pools of items means that instead of the game pre-generating unique equipment or items or anything like that, it will pull from a pre-selected or hard-coded list. And you can look at most action-based roguelikes as examples of this, from FTL, The Binding of Isaac, Dead Cells, even games that make use of CCG elements like Slay the Spire, they will have a predefined pool. Now, when it comes to these games, it's very tricky in terms of balance, because when you're dealing with a fixed pool, it means that you don't really know what the player's progression or power curve is going to be at any given point. We'll be talking more about that when we get into loot tables in the next few minutes. But when you're designing items along these lines, you always want to go a little bit more over the top with them, in the sense that you want to avoid false choices, whether it's an item that's so bad that it wrecks a run, or it's so good that the run will not work without it. And that's very important whenever you have games that deal with fixed conditions or fixed encounters. In FTL, for instance, the final boss of that game can either be ridiculously difficult or it can be a cakewalk, but it all depends on what items and components you have when you get to that point. And this is why you have to be careful when it comes to item design and balance. On the other side, because the player is the primary force for action-based roguelikes, if you design items to be too powerful, the player can easily use them to circumvent any kind of progression you have. But in that case, most people will agree that if the player discovers some awesome over-the-top build, it's usually better just to leave that in rather than try to nerf it to the ground, especially if it requires a very carefully selected number of items or components. In games like Slay the Spire or Binding of Isaac, there are some insane builds that you can have in those games, but it all depends on the RNG of what items you get. If you don't get them, you can still get around. And that's a major point when it comes to loot table design, whether it's a procedural or fixed pool of items. That the best roguelikes or best games that make use of it allow you to proceed regardless of what you're getting. It's not a case of either absolute success or dismal failure. With that said, though, let's get to the main point, and let's talk a little bit more about what loot tables are. And if you're a longtime fan of Game Wisdom, you know what we're going to talk about. But a loot table is an essential component of any game that will procedurally or randomly generate items, gear, enemies, you name it, on the fly during a gameplay. And to get more into the programming or low-level talk about it, that's probably a little bit too much for our video. But typically how it works is that you will set up an algorithm that will essentially run through a check in terms of generating items. So it kind of works like this. If we go from left to right, we start at the most common thing. So let's say the first thing the game will decide is what rarity an item will be. Normal, rare, epic, legendary, you name it. Okay, it chooses that. Then it's going to come over here and say, okay, what class will it be for? Could it be a warrior, a ranger, any class? Okay, we choose that. Now we choose what type of item. Is it an axe, dagger, bow, shoulder pauldron, anything like that? Then we come over here. If this item was, let's say, rare or higher, does it have a specific modifier? Could it be fiery, icy, shocking, bloodthirsty, you name it. Then we come over here. Does it have any additional modifiers? And then once the game goes through all that, it will generate an item. Now, each one of the categories I described has hard values that have been predefined by the designer. For instance, when I choose, let's say, the weapon type or choose the item type, that will, whatever item it chooses, will have an associated value to its stats. And this is usually in a range. Let's say an axe could have at minimum 10 points of damage. It could have at max 35. A sword could be 15 and 20. A dagger, 8 and 17. And what's happening is that the game will randomly choose where those stats are going to fall within that predefined range. The same goes for any modifiers. And what happens is when this is done, the game will just pop out an item. And what I just described happens in milliseconds. We're talking about the second you kill an enemy that the game detects that we're going to generate some loot, that item is created for you. And some developers will put a little bit more control into their loot tables, depending upon what the design may be. As we talked about before with Diablo, with patch 1.04, one of the big elements they did to the loot tables was add a greater weight to class definition. Meaning that if I'm a necromancer, I'm going to see more necromancing related items. If I'm a barbarian, more barbarian. And this is again chosen as it goes through the loot table. Now, loot table design, as you probably have assumed by now or surmised, is essential for any game that you're trying to make the loot a completely mystery or a complete mystery to the player. And the beauty of a good or a well-designed loot table is that when it works, you can literally create an infinite number of items. And the chance of two players getting the exact same item is almost incalculable. I'm sure any programmers watching it may have done it on their own end. But the beauty is that it allows you to keep the player guessing and becomes a very effective progression curve or feedback loop to keep someone invested. As we've said before, the holy trinity of the ARPG feedback loop is fight monsters to get loot, to grow more powerful, rinse and repeat for 80 to 100 hours plus. Now, with that said though, there's a very wide difference between a bad loot table and a well-designed one. And this is where a lot of developers will tend to slip up on. Because as we said before, just having the system generate loot doesn't make your game replayable. And in some cases, it can make your game worse. So there are several points I want to focus on for this part. The first one is the idea of too much loot. This is when the game will spawn so many different amounts or qualities of loot that it becomes almost impossible to kind of figure out what you should be going for. This is when every enemy can possibly drop, like, let's say, a magic or higher item. And it's very easy in a lot of ARPGs for this to happen. One big enemy group can easily just fill the screen with various items of miscellaneous adjectives. The point is, you have to make it easy for the player to parse what they're looking at. Is a fiery war axe better, or a war axe of burning fury? Is frost damage or chill damage better? Again, it all depends on your game and what kind of information you're providing them. This is where effective tooltips and UI come into play. As we've said before, one of the subtle things that Diablo did, or Blizzard did for Diablo 3, was condense all the stats and calculations down to 3 primary variables. You have power, defense, life. That's it. That's all I need to look at to determine whether an item is better or worse for me. Now, with that said though, it also depends on the complexity of your systems. In Diablo 3, elemental damage doesn't really do much. It's more of a flavor. But in Grim Dawn, that is a key component of optimizing your character. Because if I take skills that give bonuses to burning damage, or physical trauma damage, or ice damage, or anything like that, I need to be able to see on my gear, does it get a boost from that or not? And if it doesn't, I need to know that information. Now, the other point about designing an effective loot table, and this goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, is that the nightmare of loot table design is that it throws any semblance of a straightforward power and progressive curve out the window. You as a developer will not have a clear idea of what the player is going to be at any given part of the campaign. And this can be controlled depending upon how you design your loot tables. Many developers will tie the loot table to the character's level or to specific ranges of levels. Meaning if I'm level 5 through 10, I use this loot table. If I'm 11 to 17, I use this loot table. And this way, by calculating the ranges of the gear, or the ranges of all the gear in each loot table, it allows you the idea, or a somewhat loose approximation, or a ballpark figure of what the character's power level is going to be at. Many games will streamline things further and have the gear rating. And this determines, or is an abstract measurement of how powerful the player is going to be. You'll need to know if this gives you more damage or greater DPS. All you need to know is that if I have a gear rating of 500 and this boss has a gear rating of 700, I'm not ready for that fight yet. But it can become a little too abstract and removes a lot of the intricacies of loot design and building your character. Again, the beauty of games like Grim Dawn is that you can get very detailed about how your character grows based on the skill trees, the perks, the items, the constellations, you name it. Now, another big point about loot tables is that the more that you're going to randomly or procedurally generate, you have to be careful about just what the game is spawning, both in terms of the loot and in the enemy design. As we said before, you will not have any clear indication as to what players are going to be experiencing. And this can lead to very out of control game experiences. You can have someone who will get a legendary every level, or they will just be able to wipe the floor with everything, and they'll wonder, why is everyone having so much trouble? Then you'll have someone like me who can't find a rare item to save their life. And I have played games that make use of random or procedurally spawning loot tables or items and have had both happen to me. And you have to assume, you have to accommodate for everything. And this is why it's very important not to overtune encounters. You cannot build a boss fight in an ARPG that is under the assumption that the player is going to be fully slotted with ancient set items that have been, completely min-max optimized to that character. It's just not going to work. And getting that balance between making things too easy and too hard is definitely another topic in of itself. But to begin to wrap things up for today, when it comes to item generation, it's always about trying to get a somewhat measurement of what the player can do versus what the enemies they're facing. And you have to be careful about how far you take your loot table. Because if your loot table, let's say, stops at level 70, but you can keep throwing higher and higher enemies at the player, you're not really changing the game at this point. Because all you're doing is just raising numbers up. And likewise, getting higher quality gear, depending upon what the game is not going to change how you play it. Whether my sword does 50 damage or 10 million points of damage doesn't mean anything if I'm still just swinging the sword the same way. This is why legendary and items that have crazy variables or crazy modifiers can mix things up to some extent. But at some point, the player is just going to either A, hit a power point where nothing beats them, or they just don't care anymore. Yes, I do 800,000 points of damage, but now enemies have 10 billion hit points, so what's the point? But for those of you watching this, to wrap things up, can you think of great examples of loot table designs? And you can include Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, or Diablo, because those are the easy ones. And can you think of games, whether they are ARPGs, roguelikes, or anything else, that didn't work due to either not having a fixed item pool or a procedurally generated loot table? I know Valgordo's watching this. Loot Rascals doesn't count because we already talked about that. But with that said, we're going to wrap things up here. For our next part, we're going to talk about the multiplayer connection when it comes to replayability. So be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. Before we get to the credits, just want to give a quick shout out to the fans and supporters over on patreon.com/gwbicer. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwbicer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.